Hello, and welcome to another episode of Bare Bones Wargaming, a show with no bells, no whistles, no frills, just a man, a camera, and his game. On this episode, I'm just going to give a little background information on something I'm working on right now. It's a project of mine that I've been kicking around for a while. I've tried it a little bit already with another game, which I'll get into here in a minute. But when it comes to World War II, I've studied it most of my life, to be honest. I read my first book about it, the Lewis L. Snyder intro book, or the European Land Battles, which I think is Dupé's books, like when I was in 4th grade, 5th grade, somewhere around there. And ever since then, there have been two topics in World War II that have fascinated me. First one has always been the Eastern Front. I think partly because when I was a child, with all the little green army men, I liked tanks. I always thought they were cool. They were really neat. So all those thousands and thousands of tanks on the Eastern Front just fascinated me. So I've always enjoyed the Eastern Front of World War II from a study, historical, analytical, what if especially, perspective. Because let's face it, the Eastern Front of World War II is one of the greatest what if items in all of history. And then the other thing, of course, not surprisingly for those of you who've been watching my channel for a while now, one of my other favorite topics, the second most favorite topic that I have in World War II is really carrier warfare. I've always been fascinated by the carrier clashes that happened, especially in those critical early parts of World War II between the raid on Pearl Harbor and then the end of the carrier battles and stuff around Guadalcanal and that vicinity in the Southwest Pacific campaigns. After that, not so much, because things start to get a little lopsided, but that's another story for another time. So, what am I doing here today? Well, first of all, let me start by sharing this with you. What I'm working on is related to this really terrific book that I have read here in the last year or so called Enemy in the East. And you can see the subtitle there, Hitler's Secret Plans to Invade the Soviet Union. Now, it's no secret that Hitler's always had the drive to the east, the Lebensraum in the east. That was always his big goal for Germany. And over the years, I think the debate about whether Hitler really intended to defeat Britain or not, some of the stuff he said, the whole thing of holding up at Dunkirk and stuff, that he didn't want the British to be his enemy and such. With some of the new documentation coming out, it's kind of looking like that really may have been the case. That if France and Britain had minded their own business and left Germany alone, Germany would have just turned to the east. So this book basically talks about the foreign policy that Hitler was doing in the 30s, trying to entice Poland into an alliance, working with Germany. And that is part of what this all springs out of. Because during the mid-30s, as the book outlines, the German General Staff came up with plans to attack the Soviet Union. Because, again, you got to remember, too, communism was the big bugaboo. Communism was the baba, to use a good Slavic term, which basically the baba is the boogeyman. Poland had defeated the Soviet Union at the miracle of the Vistula, at the end of World War I, and possibly saved all of Europe from being overrun by Red armies. That, of course, is discussed and debated by folks. I personally subscribe to that, incidentally. So, although some people might think it's a little far-fetched, be like, oh, Poland would never have allied with Germany. Well, you know what? No one ever thought that the Nazis and the Soviets were going to have a non-aggression pact either. So, in hindsight, we always like to think, oh, this wasn't possible, or this couldn't happen. But you know what? In the heat of the moment, of course it's possible. It's kind of like if you've ever played any sports or competitive activities. You're looking afterwards, or like looking at a game of chess when you annotate it later. You're like, oh, well, that shouldn't have happened, or what the, that was a huge blunder. Yeah, because in the heat of the moment, maybe somebody didn't see anything, or, they just didn't register on them, or they weren't thinking clearly, or a multitude of different things. So my point being that looking at these scenarios that I'm going to outline here, it's interesting, and it is possible. It could have been an interesting what if that could have unfolded in history. And again, I have always been fascinated by everything related to the Eastern Front, and this book, this Enemy in the East book, really does a good job of detailing all this information with these plans and such that were devised. So I'm just going to briefly go over the plans, and I'll show you the game that I'm using here because I'm curious to see how this game is going to work out. And I've already tried this once with Columbia Games Victory in Europe, and the results are posted on Board Game Geek. I did a session report on all three and such, but I have to admit the scale and the way the block games work, I'm not convinced that the outcome is an entirely accurate one. So I'm more curious and more interested to try it with this game. So I'll show you which game this is if you don't recognize it. This is Unconditional Surrender, World War II in Europe, published by GMT Games. Salvatore Vasta designed it. And this one I think might be a much better fit with this. Now what I have set up here are the forces that were available to both sides in 1939, because the plans that were made basically were going to unleash this war against the Soviet Union in the summer of 39. By the way, if you're also interested in the whole negotiations that went on during the 30s and such, there's also one of my favorite books, and I read this years ago when I was like junior high level, I think, 8th grade maybe, Deadly Embrace by Reed and Fisher. Very fascinating look at all the stuff that went on with the Non-Aggression Pact and the negotiations, including what went on with Poland. There's even a chapter I remember, Poland's foreign policy guy was Colonel Beck, and there was a chapter entitled The One and Only Colonel Beck, because he was an interesting character. We'll just leave it at that. I'll let you read about that yourself. So, let's take a look here and see. Now, what I have the game set up for here now, let's zoom in here a little bit, now that I'm really kind of focused and talking on this. What I have the game set up for here now is one of the three possible plans that was studied by the German General Staff. One plan basically postulated an active Polish ally. You can see the Polish units here in purple, Germans are gray, and then the dark purple, if you will, are the Romanians. So basically there was going to be an alliance, which again, Romania was an ally of Germany, so not far-fetched. The Baltic states, definitely, if you read anything about Barbarossa, you know they were very sympathetic to the Germans. They were basically greeted as liberators when they came through and stuff. So I think that would have been a possibility too. But I've decided not to violate their sovereignty for the time being. The border runs here. I've left them alone for this first one. So basically, this is all-out offensive by all these forces driving into the Soviet Union to defeat the USSR. Now, of course, this would be the most challenging scenario for the Soviet Union in 1939, which, of course, the Soviets just coming off the purges, extremely weak. It could have been a big old mess. We'll see. But definitely a big advantage having an active Polish ally, because if nothing else, you got to have all these guys that are tied down here, and of course they can drive into the southern part of Russia here, the Ukraine, while the Germans, of course, are driving north of the Pripyat marshes. Which, by the way, great book also if you're interested in the Eastern Front, called Barbarossa Unleashed by Craig Luther. Just follows Army Group Center from the beginning of the invasion, well, even before the invasion, to December of 1941. Fascinating look at all of that. But his description of, what we usually refer to, excuse me, as the marshes, as like a primeval forest, is fascinating. It's a really great book that weaves together big picture with first-person accounts. Lots of diaries and letters and such from the soldiers. So if you're interested, it is, quite frankly, and I've read Glantz, I've read other books, I've read Stahl's books, but that book is the single best book I have ever read about Barbarossa to date thus far. I almost wish he would do one on Army Group North and Army Group South as well, too. Although his overall conclusion, I'm sure, would not change. But, point being that the dividing line here, as you can see, with all this muck and, just like hearkening back to like the Stone Age kind of thing, divides here and stuff. So that was one plan. Now, another plan involved if Poland was neutral. Now, if Poland was neutral, the General Staff came up with two other ideas. One was a drive through the Baltic states, a drive through to come up here, secure Leningrad, and then go after Moscow after that. That springboard could have been both from East Prussia here, but also, of course, could have had the active involvement of the Baltic states as well, too. And I'm going to take a look at both of those options here, just postulating both of those. You know, either the Baltic states just having their armies, which they are available in this game, that's part of the reason I picked this game, and then having Germany just pouring out of East Prussia across. When I tried that one in the other game, that one was the weakest one. That was hard, and I think part of it was because of the frontage. It just was difficult. The other option, if Poland decided to stay neutral, was the southern option. Make alliances with Romania and Hungary and such, and then Germany would drive here, just up through all this space here, driving to Moscow, drive into the rich resource and industrial areas of the Soviet Union too. That one, by the way, also was very successful as well too. So basically 3 major plans here that I'm going to be looking at using unconditional surrender and the mechanics to go with it. Because again, I do think it's an interesting system for World War II. Now, I'm not sure how much of it I'm going to show. I might show some of the gameplay because again, that's always been the focus of my videos. But in this particular case, I guess the videos I'm going to be doing on this are more about the kind of what if, the hypothetical situation, which again is fascinating. And I have to admit, I always love what if stuff. That's why I've enjoyed Cataclysm so much. That's why the old Victory Games carrier, a lot of times in that game when I do the random scenario generator, I postulate that, you know, instead of diluting themselves with both the offensive in the South Pacific, in the Solomons, and New Guinea, and also Midway, basically the Japanese not doing Midway, which means, of course, then, you know, like the Akagi, the Kagu, the Hiryu, and the Soryu would all be available for that, and that makes for some interesting and challenging scenarios as well. So I am a big what-if kind of guy. So if you're interested in this topic, if you're interested in the Eastern Front, I will come back with it and just give you some overviews, talk about what happened, outline some things, maybe try to find a way that when I'm done with this, if I don't do a whole lot of like actual, you know, move by move, play by play sort of things, more of a synopsis approach to this. Again, I'm not sure which way I want to go. Part of it also, of course, will be how quickly I get the game system under control. I've already tried the Polish, the Norwegian, and the French training intro scenarios, if you will. So I'm feeling pretty good about the rules. This rule system is pretty straightforward and clear once you get the grasp of how it works. You know, that it's not, combat's not separate from, you know, movement and stuff. It's mobile combat, it's part of it, and all of that sort of thing as well. So that's where I'm at right now, dealing with that, and then I'm not sure again where I'm going to go after this. It's hard to tell. Take a look around. Again, I got those 3 games coming. The Skies Over the Reich, Hitler's Reich, and No Retreat 3. No Retreat 3 I might try because that might be high on my list because the Polish campaign, of course, is one of the harder things to simulate. And right now, my favorite Polish campaign, I have to dig it out, is that Nightmare Begins one. I think that was a Command Magazine issue, if I remember correctly. I don't know, it's floating around here somewhere in my boxes. Which, by the way, actually, since I just mentioned that, let me just show you this real quick to finish this video off. Not that. This. Somebody mentioned this on Board Game Geek about using the book boxes that you can use to send books in the mail and stuff. And I've been doing that, and it's been working out great. I put 2 or 3 games in each one, and it's great for organization. I'm loving it. So just kind of a sharing thing. You know, if you're trying to find a way to store your magazine games and stuff, I think this is a good way to go about doing it, because you can see some there here on like the end. I've got 3 there at the end. I've got Iwo and Midway Solitaire and Kido Butai all together because they're fairly small games. And most of the other ones I have 2 games in a piece. So anyway, so we'll see how this Enemy Knees goes with these scenarios and this analysis and this what if, the very interesting, intriguing thing in history. Speaking of which, I understand, and again, this is just from what I've read and gathered, that there's some interesting analysis about this in Ian Kershaw's 2-volume biography of Hitler, which I have not read yet, but it is sitting on my shelf. Oh, on one of these bookcases here somewhere, probably towards the back, more than likely. But again, the book that I'm basing a lot of this on, if you're interested, here, whoops, okay, that's way too close. Let's try this again. Is this one again here. This author also has an excellent book called The Unknown Eastern Front, which is about all the Allied armies, like the Romanians and the Hungarians and the Italians that served on the Eastern Front too. And I have that on my shelf. I just haven't got around to reading it. But this was fascinating reading if you're interested in this particular topic. So again, that's the book that I'm basing all this gaming on. So we'll see how this goes. I am curious to see and compare it with the other game that I've already tried on the European strategy level. And quite frankly, if any of you have suggestions that you think would be a good grand strategy war in Europe kind of game like this that might also be a good candidate to test this out with, I'd be curious to see those thoughts and ideas. Because again, I'm always willing to try something new and something different when I'm seeking information and knowledge. It's one of my favorite things to do. So, until next time, this is Tim Korchnoi from Bare Bones Wargaming saying thank you for watching, and I'll get back to you and we'll see how things play out with the enemy in the east.